When it's finished, you'll find this where I told you. One simple line of dialogue, 10 words spoken by Joe the Hitman about the notorious blue key. Most viewers understand why the key matters. Once Diane has it, Camilla is dead. But few stop to ask a much simpler question. Where did Diane get it? That question isn't unknowable. It's not abstract. The film quietly gives us the answer. And once you figure it out, along with everything else I'm going to explain, the meaning becomes clear. It all makes sense. I'm Mike. This is Mike on Media. Join me as we go for a ride on David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. Mulholland Drive is a singular cinematic experience, a surreal neo-noir mystery set against the backdrop of broken dreams and Hollywood corruption at the turn of the millennium. Since its release in 2001, it's fascinated audiences while stubbornly refusing to explain itself, fueling decades of debate over what's real, what isn't, and whether the film can ever truly be understood. David Lynch was famously unwilling to explain the movie, albeit he did publish 10 clues intended to point viewers in the right direction. What's discussed less often, however, is how the film was made. Much of Mulholland Drive began as a television pilot, written to raise questions long before there was any kind of a need for answers. Only later, when the project transitioned from pilot to feature film, did Lynch return to shoot more scenes and then restructure all the various pieces into a meaningful puzzle. This matters because the meaning of Mulholland Drive isn't accidental, it's not arbitrary, but it's also not fully architected. It's constructed, some would say retrofitted, into the form that we now know. And within this construction lies the key to understanding how its pieces actually fit together. To really understand Mulholland Drive, we need a deliberate approach. We'll begin with a brief summary of the story, just enough to establish a foundation for analysis. From there, we'll move into what I see as the film's structural anchor, the nonlinear reality section at the end of the movie. Then we'll work backward into the dream, not merely labeling it as such, but examining how and why it takes the form that it does. Finally, we'll step back and consider a couple elements that deserve special attention. Taken together, this approach will allow us to understand not only the film's most important pieces, but how those pieces interlock to form a coherent and meaningful picture. Released in 2001, Mulholland Drive stars Naomi Watts, Laura Harring, Justin Theroux, and even has an appearance by country music star Billy Ray Cyrus. The film opens with a violent car crash on Mulholland Drive that leaves a mysterious, dark-haired woman with amnesia. She makes her way into Los Angeles where she encounters Betty Elms, an upbeat, optimistic young woman chasing the familiar dream of becoming a Hollywood movie star. Betty takes in the injured woman, who adopts the name Rita, and together they attempt to uncover Rita's identity. As the two women grow closer, the film cuts away to a series of seemingly unrelated storylines. A Hollywood director finds artistic control of his film taken away by shadowy figures who insist on casting a specific actress. A man recounts a recurring nightmare involving a monster-like homeless person behind a particular diner. An inept hitman steals a mysterious book, leaving behind him a laughable wake of accidental violence. Each storyline unfolds with little overt explanation and little to suggest how or even if they connect. Soon after, as the film progresses, details surrounding Rita's identity begin to surface, including a mysterious blue key and later a matching blue box. Suddenly, the narrative takes a dramatic shift, recontextualizing earlier events and introducing new versions of familiar characters. Relationships change, personalities invert, and the tone of the film becomes more realistic, but also darker. In short order, the movie reaches its dramatic conclusion, without explicit clarification, leaving the audience to reflect on a set of events, images, and moments that resist straightforward interpretation. In the film's final section, the dreamlike Hollywood fantasy collapses, giving way to a harsher and more fragmented reality centered on Diane Selwyn. Diane comes from Deep River, Ontario, where she won a jitterbug contest. This part of Diane's past is captured by the pre-credit opening sequence, which frames it as a moment of triumph. An elderly couple, probably the contest judges, is shown flanking Diane, beaming with encouragement. Diane eventually arrives in Hollywood, where her Aunt Ruth had genuine ties to the film industry. Ruth has passed away and left Diane with an inheritance, giving Diane a foothold in Los Angeles, but little else. In social situations, Diane appears deeply uncomfortable and ill at ease, something especially evident during the later dinner party scene, where she struggles to engage naturally with others and seems perpetually out of place. Diane auditions for the lead role in the Sylvia North story. It's also implied that she sleeps with the film's director, Bob Brooker, in an attempt to advance her career. Regardless, she doesn't get the part. As Diane explains it, Brooker didn't think much of me, an assessment that likely extended beyond just her acting talent. During this time, Diane meets Camilla Rhodes, who ultimately lands the coveted lead role. It's implied that Camilla may have also slept with Brooker. Camilla appears to effortlessly infatuate those around her, including Brooker, Diane herself, and later director Adam Kesher. Diane and Camilla develop a close friendship that later grows into a sexual relationship, but the imbalance between them is clear. Camilla is ambitious and emotionally detached, while Diane grows increasingly dependent and vulnerable. Camilla's behavior toward Diane is often manipulative and cruel. She shows little concern for Diane's emotional well-being and appears to derive pleasure from deliberately hurting Diane. This cruelty culminates at the dinner party where Adam and Camilla announce their engagement. Diane feels emotionally devastated and humiliated. In one of the more obvious instances of symbolism, Diane drinks from a coffee cup that has a pattern design that resembles the letters SOS, the famous international distress signal. During the earlier part of the scene, Coco, Adam's mother, is notably sympathetic toward Diane, offering one of the few moments of true compassion in the sequence. Crushed by Camilla's rejection and the realization that she's unlikely to achieve her dreams of Hollywood stardom, Diane hires a hitman to kill Camilla. The murder is carried out, and the hitman leaves behind a blue key as confirmation that the job is done. The presence of the blue key is an important part of the nonlinear reality section of the movie. It lets the audience understand the true scene ordering. As Diane's guilt and paranoia intensify, she's acutely aware that detectives are trying to contact her in connection with Camilla's murder. When someone knocks at her door, presumably the police, Diane suffers a complete mental breakdown. Hallucinating and overwhelmed, she imagines herself being chased by the elderly couple from the jitterbug contest. Their once encouraging presence is now transformed into something accusatory and monstrous. Unable to escape her guilt and her collapsing reality, Diane is chased to her bedroom where she takes her own life. Understanding this grim reality, we're now in a position to interpret Diane's dream, which happens after she's retrieved the blue key and thus confirmed that Camilla is dead. The dream starts at the beginning of the movie, just after a point-of-view shot showing somebody, undoubtedly Diane, putting their head down on a pillow. In the dream, people are recast as other people, based on Diane's opinions, perceptions, and psychological torment. First and foremost, professionally untalented, socially awkward, and emotionally vulnerable Diane becomes Betty, a beautiful and naturally gifted acting talent who is upbeat, articulate, and comfortable in all situations. Betty is an idealized version of Diane, the person Diane wishes she was. Camilla is no longer a manipulative seductress who instantly infatuates men and cruelly toys with Diane. Instead, she is now Rita, a troubled, helpless, vulnerable, lost soul who is entirely dependent on Betty. The woman who kissed Camilla at the dinner party, Diane's competition, becomes the new Camilla Rhodes, whom we'll call Dream Camilla. She's another actress, Betty's competition, who ultimately and unjustly beats out Betty. As we see later in the movie, the opening shot along Mulholland Drive is Diane's subconscious recreating the car ride that she experienced on the way to the dinner party. This time, however, it's Camilla's alter ego, Rita, who is taking the ride. Rita delivers the line, "We don't stop here," at the same location where Diane had said the line.
What are you doing? We don't stop here.
In the dream, Rita is about to be murdered when she's miraculously saved by a fatal head-on collision that leaves her with a head injury and amnesia. This is, of course, Diane's subconscious constructing fantasies rooted in Camilla magically avoiding the murder-for-hire machinery that Diane put in motion. The location of the accident is significant. In reality, it's where Diane was the victim of emotional violence. The limousine stopped early so that Camilla could personally lead Diane, hand in hand, to the dinner party. This unintentionally, or more likely intentionally, caused Diane to hope that Camilla was reconsidering their relationship, as did the line during their earlier phone conversation, "It means so much to me." Of course, this setup intensified the emotional devastation that Diane soon felt when Camilla callously kissed another woman in front of her, and later, Adam and Camilla announced their engagement. Relatedly, the scene of this emotional violence, or the start of it at least, becomes the scene of actual vehicular violence in the dream. Soon after, Rita, although the character is actually nameless at this point, makes her way down to LA, eventually ends up in Aunt Ruth's apartment and falls asleep. The movie then cuts to the Winkie's restaurant. The important thing about the Winkie's sequence is to realize that it's bookended by shots of Rita sleeping, implying that it happens as part of her dream. A dream within a dream, so to speak. To really understand what's happening here, we have to review some of the details from the scene where Diane hires the hitman. Of all the scenes in Mulholland Drive, this is the one that ties together many other parts of the movie. Of course, the charismatic waitress being named Betty is clearly the motivation for Diane's subconscious choosing the name Betty for her idealized self, albeit this doesn't feel like too much of a revelation. Diane using the line, "This is the girl," when giving Joe a picture of Camilla so that he can recognize her, is the genesis of this line appearing numerous times throughout the dream sequence. This is the precise moment when Diane's actions enable the hitman to accomplish his murderous deed, and it's weighing heavily on her psyche.
This is the girl.
This is the girl. This is the girl. This is the girl. This is the girl.
This is the girl. This is the girl.
Diane's purse, with the money used to pay the hitman, looks just like Rita's purse, which, of course, contains a large amount of money and the blue key. When Joe asks Diane, "You sure you want this?" and she responds, "More than anything in this world," we get an understanding of how emotionally damaged Diane actually is. "I want this more than anything in this world" is a common sentiment expressed in Hollywood, but it's usually declared by aspiring actors describing their dreams of stardom. Undoubtedly, Diane felt this way when she arrived in Hollywood. Now, however, after prolonged rejection by the film industry, Camilla, and probably others, and being the emotionally abused play toy of a person who seemingly is getting everything that Diane ever wanted, her dark side has co-opted this sentiment and retargeted it directly toward Camilla's murder. Finally, we arrive at the most important line in the scene, if not the movie. Joe holds up a blue key and says, "When it's finished, you'll find this where I told you." At this precise moment, Diane looks over and sees the man who becomes Dan in the Winkie's dream turn and look at her with an awkward expression. Diane then asks the naive question, "What does it open?" In response, Joe just laughs. The blue key literally opens nothing. It's simply a symbol used to communicate the status of the hitman's job. Figuratively, however, the answer to the question is completely different. The key will open a whole new reality in which Diane has become a murderer. Moreover, if a blue key were to open something, what would be a logical thing for it to open? The answer, of course, is a blue box. The new reality in which Diane is Camilla's murderer originated from her purse with the money used to pay Joe the hitman. In the dream, the blue box representing the reality mysteriously originates in the purse of Diane's alter ego, Betty. But there's more. Most people miss the importance of the phrase, "You'll find this where I told you." Where exactly is Joe talking about? In my experience, most viewers think that the key will be left in some inconsequential place that we, the audience, could not possibly know, and therefore it doesn't really matter. What's important is that we know Diane did retrieve the key, and hence Camilla is dead. This conclusion is reasonable. However, I suggest there is an inferable answer to the question. That answer is the alley behind Winkie's. Figuring this out allows us to understand the importance of the homeless person who lives in the alley. The ugly homeless person represents the ugly side of Diane's character who arranged for Camilla's death. He lives in the alley behind Winkie's because that's where this ugliness truly came to life, in the form of the hitman leaving the blue key there, signifying Camilla is dead. Interestingly, Dan refers to the ugly homeless person as a man, but the character is actually played by a woman, likely because it's a representation of Diane. In a scene near the end of the movie, there's some very interesting and meaningful imagery. Diane is staring at the blue key, which is shown on the edge of a coffee table with a coffee mug nearby. The coffee mug is exactly the same as the type of mug used at Winkie's. The reflection of the coffee mug extends toward the key, almost reaching it. This arrangement is not accidental. The construction took precise positioning and point of view consideration. My interpretation is this. Reflections are representations. This reflection is a representation of the coffee mug. What else does the coffee mug represent? The answer is Winkie's. So, the blue key being in close proximity to the coffee mug's reflection is symbolic of it having been retrieved in close proximity to Winkie's, in particular, the alley behind Winkie's. With this knowledge, we can now fully interpret the Winkie's dream sequence. The first observation to make is that these characters, Dan and Herb, look remarkably like each other. This is because, in the dream, they are both a version of real-life Dan. He is, in essence, debating with himself. This is why Dan describes Herb as standing where real-life Dan stood while witnessing the murder-for-hire transaction. Herb is condescending because Dan is arguing with a more logical and skeptical version of himself, trying to decide if he really saw what he thinks he saw. In other words, does this ugly, murderous side of Diane really exist? Additionally, the dream character being named Dan is important because the name means judge or he who judges. Furthermore, Dan is usually short for Daniel, which means God is my judge. This choice of name by Diane's subconscious is likely an indication that she's concerned about being judged for her actions, either secularly, religiously, or morally, or perhaps all three. Of note, Dan is sitting where the hitman sat, likely signifying that his character in the dream is somehow related to the death of Camilla. Describing his dream, Dan says, "It's the second one I've had, but they're both the same." This statement is likely a reference to the fact that the Winkie's dream sequence is actually a dream within a dream. Specifically, Rita's dream within Diane's dream. Technically, Dan is describing his dream, which is a dream within a dream within a dream. Nevertheless, the dream is exactly the same because it's the same dream, it's just happening at two different levels. Dan then goes on to say, "It's not day or night, it's kind of half night, you know?" Dan is describing a transition. It could be either day to night or night to day, but because of the context, we know that the transition is day to night. This transition in Dan's dream is symbolic of Diane transitioning from not being a murderer to being a murderer. The ugliness behind Winkie's appears during this transition from good to bad, or more symbolically, from light to dark, or day to night. The transition is the half night. The rest of the scene plays out as we know that it does, with Dan literally being scared to death while confirming that Diane's murderous ugliness does indeed exist. Much of Diane's dream involves an exaggeration of the unjust dark underbelly of Hollywood. In this sense, Hollywood is like an all-powerful machine that cares only about making money, not about the art of film, the well-being of the artist, or anything else. It chews up and spits out actors, directors, and anyone else who has the misfortune of being on the wrong side of some arbitrary line. It benefits a powerful few while leaving in its wake a discarded, talented many. It's able to unjustly influence any and all decisions in Hollywood and also dispose of troublesome individuals at will. Sitting atop the hierarchy of this Hollywood machine is Mr. Rogue, a strange, disproportioned, wheelchair-bound man who wields power from some mysterious and undisclosed location deep in the bowels of seedy Hollywood. In the next scene of the dream, we see Mr. Rogue initiate a convoluted chain reaction with a phone call during which he simply says, "The girl is still missing," implying another hitman needs to be dispatched to murder Rita. The intermediates in the message chain say few words, almost as if employing a commonplace code, used to speed up transactions that are happening all of the time. The last phone call is placed using a non-standard dial sequence, suggesting the reach of the Hollywood machine extends into all aspects of everyday life. Finally, the call terminates at what we later learn to be Diane's phone. Here, Diane's subconscious is basically saying, if you want Camilla dead, call Diane. Next up, we're introduced to Betty as she arrives at the airport in LA. Interestingly, she's accompanied by 2 travel partners whom she apparently met on the plane. This couple is actually the same elderly couple who were shown flanking Diane when she won the jitterbug contest at the beginning of the movie. The couple traveling with Betty is symbolic of them bringing her to LA to pursue her dreams, based on the encouragement they must have given her. In the dream, the woman is named Irene while the man remains nameless. Irene's an ironic choice of name in that Irene means peace, and as we know, hallucinations about the elderly couple will end up fatally tormenting Diane. Betty also uses Irene's name excessively when talking to her. This isn't accidental. The implication is that Diane is awkward in social situations and hardly ever uses a person's name while conversing. She knows that people who are very comfortable in social situations often use other people's names in conversation effortlessly, and she's jealous of those people. Therefore, Betty, the idealized version of Diane, uses other people's names in conversation, almost to the point of being comical. The telltale instance of this dynamic is evident when Diane and Betty each meet their counterpart, the Winkie's waitress. Dream Betty says Diane's name. Real-world Diane does not say Betty's name. After the elderly couple and Diane go their separate ways, we see the couple in the back of a limousine, strangely euphoric. In Diane's dream, there are multiple occurrences of limousines. Limousines are symbolic of the corrupt Hollywood power structure. The implication is that the elderly couple is responsible for bringing Betty, Diane's alter ego, to Los Angeles as part of the Hollywood machine. They're especially happy about having accomplished their job. Furthermore, the limousine is momentarily shown accelerating while following a blue van. What is a blue van? It's a big blue box with wheels. This shot is symbolic of the elderly couple, a part of the Hollywood machine, ending up in the blue box. It's why later, after the blue box is opened, the couple escapes, finds Diane, and fatally torments her. After a taxi ride, Betty arrives at her Aunt Ruth's apartment complex and meets the manager, Coco Lenoir. To understand the dream version of Coco, we have to revisit the dinner party. When Diane first arrives at the party, she's introduced to Adam's mother, Coco. After an awkward exchange, Diane is made to feel bad for having kept everybody from eating. Soon after, while at the dinner table, Diane tells the story of how she came to Hollywood and became friends with Camilla. Coco listens sympathetically while eating nuts. Eventually, after having read between the lines, Coco shows some genuine compassion, saying, "I see," while patting Diane's hand. And importantly, when Adam and Camilla are about to announce their engagement, Coco has a look of unhappiness, almost rolling her eyes, indicating she likely sees Camilla for the self-serving, manipulative person that she really is. Because of these reasons, Diane likes Coco, which results in her subconscious casting Coco as the protective apartment manager figure who eventually is very skeptical and distrustful of Camilla's alter ego, Rita. When Betty introduces herself to Coco, we learn that Coco's last name is Lenoir. This name is unlikely to be the real Coco's last name in that Lenoir is French for the nut, meaning that Diane's subconscious likely chose the name based on the fact that Coco was eating nuts while talking to her. Also, when we compare Betty and Coco's introduction to Diane and Coco's introduction, there's one interesting difference. At the dinner party, Coco says, "Pleased to meet you." In the dream, however, Betty is the one who says, "Pleased to meet you." She also uses the same line during other introductions in the dream. There's an argument to be made that Diane associates Coco with Hollywood elegance. This is why it's so fitting for Coco to be played by Ann Miller, a famous actress from the golden age of Hollywood. When Coco says, "Pleased to meet you," Diane associates the phrase with Hollywood elegance. This is how glamorous Hollywood types are supposed to handle introductions. It's the kind of phrase that Elodie's socially awkward Diane would never use, but Diane's subconscious idealized version of herself begins to use it all the time. And again, we have Betty using Coco's name immediately after Coco says, "Just call me Coco, everybody does." Diane wouldn't do this, but Betty does it without hesitation. On the way to Aunt Ruth's apartment, Coco and Betty encounter dog shit in the courtyard. There are two reasonable interpretations for this, and in my opinion, they're both correct. First, Betty encountering shit shortly after meeting Coco is symbolic of Diane encountering shit shortly after meeting Coco by being made to feel bad about keeping everybody from eating. Second, as Diane tells the table about her story, the person sitting next to her, named Wilkins, makes some comments that undoubtedly made Diane feel uncomfortable. First, when Diane mentions that she met Camilla on the set of the Sylvia North story, a movie where Diane had auditioned for the lead role, Wilkins says Camilla was great in that, which Diane almost certainly interprets as, "It's good that they chose Camilla for the role and not you." Second, when Diane mentions the director of the film, Wilkins effectively makes Diane acknowledge the director's name, Bob Brooker. Having had a bad experience with the director, Diane likely would have preferred not to mention his name. Again, these actions amount to Diane encountering shit, which is why, in the dream, the dog responsible for the shit in the courtyard is owned by a tenant named Wilkins. Once Betty and Coco are in Aunt Ruth's apartment, Coco says the curious line, "If you like, later on, I'll introduce you around. Well, no hard feelings if you don't." This line is almost certainly rooted in Diane's dysfunctional social skill set. The suggestion is that normally Diane would likely have anxiety about the prospect of going around and being introduced to everybody. If somebody were to offer to take her around, she likely would want to back out of it, but she would know that doing so is socially unacceptable. Here, without any prompting from Betty, Coco is straight up offering her a way out that Diane would very much take. Of course, with these various events happening within a dream, they're all manifestations of Diane's subconscious. One interpretation may be rooted in Diane, the next geared toward Betty. A similar case can be made regarding Camilla and Rita. This is the brilliance and the absurdity of dream logic, and honestly, why, if done well, it's the perfect tool for conveying symbolism and abstract meaning. Of course, if it's done poorly, it can devolve into a convoluted mess. Fortunately, David Lynch handles it exceptionally well. When Betty and Rita first meet and talk, there's a lot to process. First off, Rita, who is amnesic and relatedly doesn't have a name at this point, decides to claim that her name is Rita based on seeing Rita Hayworth on a poster for the 1946 movie Gilda. Interestingly, the poster includes the tagline for the movie, "There never was a woman like Gilda." Gilda was played by Rita. The tagline can be thought of hinting at the idea that there never was a woman like Rita. In other words, Rita is a desperate fabrication of Diane's subconscious. Soon after, Betty has the following very telling few lines of dialogue. "I couldn't afford a place like this in a million years, unless, of course, I'm discovered and become a movie star. Well, of course, I'd rather be known as a great actress than a movie star. But, sometimes people end up being both, so that is, I guess you'd say, sort of why I came here." This perspective is almost delusional, and it serves to highlight the difference between Diane and her idealized self, Betty. Diane is struggling just to keep her head above water, both professionally and also in terms of her personal relationships. Meanwhile, Betty is concerned that she might have the problem of becoming a movie star who's not sufficiently respected for her acting talent. It's almost laughable. Betty then says, "I'm sorry, I'm just so excited to be here. I mean, I just came here from Deep River, Ontario, and now I'm in this dream place. You can imagine how I feel." In November of 2025, I had the opportunity to see a screening of Mulholland Drive at the University of Southern California. Naomi Watts and Mary Sweeney, the editor for the movie, were present and answered questions afterward. One interesting tidbit that came out of the question and answer session was Naomi explaining that originally her character was not from Deep River, Ontario. David Lynch apparently added the detail over concern about Naomi's Australian accent. The reference to this dream place is almost certainly a relatively straightforward hint that we're witnessing a dream. When Rita lies down to sleep, we see that Aunt Ruth has left a very elegant robe for Betty. Betty uses the robe to cover Rita. There's some significant symbolism going on here. For starters, the red and black robe is reminiscent of the red and black robe-like dress that Coco wore at the dinner party. And again, I suggest that Diane associates Coco with Hollywood elegance. Hence, the red and black robe, which is a gift from Aunt Ruth, who has legitimate ties to the movie industry, represents Hollywood elegance. Secondly, the robe, which Betty effectively gives to Rita, is symbolic of this Hollywood elegance that was meant for Betty, somehow ending up bestowed upon Rita. We also see Rita continue to use the robe later during the dream sequence. This is a subconscious manifestation of Diane's belief that she deserved some or all of the success that Camilla achieved. Finally, the elegant, expensive robe stands in stark contrast to the dingy robe that Diane wears in the reality sequence. The elegant robe is how Diane wishes her life was. The dingy robe is how it really is. The scene in which director Adam Kasher meets with the Castiglione brothers is just pure absurdity, albeit funny absurdity. Here we see the Hollywood machine in action, taking away creative control from Adam. We also get to see the dream version of Camilla Rhodes for the first time. Again, she's the woman who, later at the dinner party, Diane sees kissing Camilla. Although Betty doesn't know it, she will be unjustly denied the lead role in Adam's movie because the Hollywood machine insists that it be given to Camilla Rhodes. This is Diane's subconscious casting a woman who kissed Camilla as Betty's competition. This Camilla Rhodes wins out over Betty, not because of talent, but because of the unjust Hollywood power structure. We also get several iterations of the line, "This is the girl," for good measure. As Adam leaves, he vandalizes the Castiglione brothers' limousine. Again, the limousine is a symbol of the Hollywood machine. Soon after, we witness the inept hitman, otherwise known as Joe, at work. The scene starts with Joe talking to a man named Ed. Though not explicitly spelled out, the two are clearly talking about the fatal car crash that thwarted the hit on Rita. Interestingly, Joe says, "Yeah, I hope you're not going to get in any trouble," referring to the hit not going as planned because of the car crash. Ed doesn't understand the implication of the line. Joe is actually there to murder Ed as a consequence of what happened. Joe does in fact kill Ed and steals the book on Ed's desk, the so-called History of the World and Phone Numbers. This is the same book, rubber band and all, that Reality Joe has when he talks to Diane. It's also likely not a coincidence that Joe shoots Ed in the head and that Rita suffered a head injury during the car crash. These facts are Diane making an indirect reference to the real-life violence perpetrated against Camilla. The rest of the hit goes tragically and comically wrong, resulting in the deaths of 2 other people and the building alarm going off. This chain of events is especially unfortunate given that Joe was trying to make Ed's death look like a suicide. Of course, what's really going on here is that Diane's subconscious is fixating on the idea of Joe being an incompetent hitman because she's trying to imagine ways in which Camilla is not really dead and she herself is not really a murderer. In reality, Joe is not an incompetent hitman. When Betty talks to Aunt Ruth, confronts Rita about not knowing Aunt Ruth, and the 2 of them open Rita's purse, the dream story introduces 3 elements related to the real-life murder-for-hire plot: a large amount of money, a blue key, and concern about somebody calling the police. Next, Joe and an accomplice are shown talking to a local prostitute, asking if she's seen anybody resembling Rita. This scene is important because of how it ends. Specifically, it's revealed that Joe is driving a blue van and the prostitute climbs into the back of it. Again, the blue van is a representation of the blue box. As mentioned earlier, in real life, the blue key left by the hitman figuratively opens a new reality in which Diane is a murderer. In the dream, we're aware of 2 things going into the symbolic blue box: the strange euphoric elderly couple and now a prostitute. We can think of the contents of the blue box as the parts of Diane's life that drove her to becoming a murderer. And yes, it's likely no coincidence that the metaphor is driving her to becoming a murderer, and the symbolic blue box is, in fact, a van apparently being driven by Joe the hitman. The elderly jitterbug contest judges were well-meaning in their efforts of encouraging Diane to pursue her dreams, but the fact of the matter is that were it not for their actions, Diane would not have been dropped into the Hollywood machine that chews up and spits out many a person who does not achieve stardom. The prostitute is more challenging to interpret. One could argue that the scene is suggesting Diane literally became a prostitute during her time in Hollywood. However, the likelihood of this being the intended interpretation is low. We know that Diane had sufficient money to pay the hitman based on the inheritance that she received from Aunt Ruth. It's unlikely she reached a level of desperation that would have led to prostitution. More likely, Diane symbolically prostituted herself by sleeping with directors and/or other people in the Hollywood power structure in attempts to advance her career. The strategy didn't work and was emotionally devastating in that it left her feeling humiliated and devalued. As she talks with Betty, Rita remembers that the car she was in was headed to Mulholland Drive. This fact is the first substantive memory that Rita has, so it feels like a breakthrough. Betty convinces Rita to join her on a trip to a restaurant so that they can call the police from a payphone in order to try to glean information about a possible car crash on Mulholland Drive. During the conversation, Betty says,
"Come on, it'll be just like in the movies. We'll pretend to be someone else."
This dialogue is hinting at a mysterious and pervasive lack of identity that runs throughout the story. Also, the final comment is dramatic irony in that Diane's subconscious already has Diane and Camilla pretending to be somebody else in the form of Betty and Rita. The final shot of the scene is framed with a recreation of a famous painting, often called the portrait of Beatrice Cenci, situated right between Betty and Rita. There's been much controversy around the original version of this painting. Who painted the portrait, and even whether or not it actually is a portrait of Beatrice Cenci, a young woman who was executed in 1599, are topics that have been debated for hundreds of years. So, a painting of an uncertain woman, created by an uncertain artist, sits between a woman who doesn't know who she is and a woman who is not who she appears to be. It all feels very fitting. The subplot involving Adam coming home early and finding his wife Lorraine in bed with Gene the pool guy, aka Billy Ray Cyrus, is funny and a clear reference to a small bit of conversation at the dinner party. There's also one line of dialogue that likely has ulterior meaning. When Gene says, "Just forget you ever saw it, it's better that way." This is likely Diane's subconscious toying with the idea that when somebody sees something bad, it's better for them to just forget about it and not do anything. It's stemming from concern over real-life Dan having witnessed a murder for hire transaction, Diane hoping that he'll just forget he ever saw it. There's some definite color symbolism going on in Mulholland Drive. Rita is usually shown wearing black and red. Black, in this case and elsewhere, is used to symbolize death. Red is likely a representative of the violence that led to her death. Previously, I explained how the black and red robe can be thought of as representing misplaced Hollywood elegance. An additional interpretation is that Betty covering Rita with the red and black robe is symbolic of Diane being responsible for the violence and death that was bestowed upon Camilla. Of note, Adam is always wearing black, and when he leaves his house, he's shown with a bloody nose, which he received during his altercation with Gene the pool guy. This additional instance of black and red may well be intended to imply that Adam, Camilla's real-world fiancé, may have become collateral damage during Camilla's murder. This may have actually happened and Diane may have knowledge of it, or it may be the case that Diane is simply concerned about the possibility. Later, when the limousine visits Adam's house and the bodyguard starts calling out for Adam, Lorraine says he's never coming back, ever. This line is likely a reference to Adam being dead. The colors blue and pink are also definitely being used in some symbolic way. If you have ideas about what these colors mean, please share them in the comments. Next, we see Betty and Rita make their way to a payphone, which happens to be the payphone that we saw earlier outside of Winkie's. Betty calls the police and is able to verify that there was an accident at Mulholland Drive, but hangs up after the officer asks, "May I have your name, please?" Again, we get the general sense that identity is somehow a problem, and Betty's not willing to identify herself because she's the creation of a troubled mind, in some sense pretending to be somebody she isn't. Also, it's important that Betty is calling the police from this particular payphone. Winkie's is essentially the scene of the murder for hire crime. In fact, given the layout of the restaurant and the positioning of the payphone, the call is being made mere feet away from the booth where Joe the Hitman and Diane had their conversation. This call is an expression that Diane is worried about somebody, almost certainly real-life Dan, calling or otherwise going to the police and turning her in because of her involvement in the murder for hire plot. We also see Betty and Rita approach the payphone in the reflection of the Winkie's window. Reflections are used quite a bit with Betty and Rita in Mulholland Drive. This is because reflections are a representation of the reflected image, not the reflected image itself. Similarly, Betty and Rita are representations of Diane and Camilla. After Betty and Rita have a cup of coffee at Winkie's, sitting in the same booth, with Betty sitting where Dan previously sat and where Joe the Hitman will later sit, the waitress's name tag sparks another memory. Fittingly, the charismatic waitress named Betty from the real world has been replaced by an awkward version of herself who is named Diane. Upon returning home, Rita informs Betty that she remembers the name Diane Selwyn. Looking up the name in the phone book, they find a single entry for D. Selwyn. When they call the number, there's some important dialogue. Betty says, "It's strange to be calling yourself." Rita replies, "Maybe it's not me." Of course, it's not Rita or Camilla. And Betty, in a sense, is calling herself. We then hear an answering machine message, "Hello, it's me, leave a message." Later, when Camilla calls Diane, asking her to go to the dinner party, we hear exactly the same message. The Hollywood power structure shutting down Adam's picture, taking all of his money, and tracking him down in some seedy, no-name hotel is just further illustration of the organization's omnipotence. The sequence with the cowboy is certainly one of the stranger aspects of the movie. Nevertheless, it's interesting, compelling, and drives home a similar point. The Hollywood machine can reach anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. Perhaps surprisingly, I really don't think there's too much to say about the cowboy. Next, we see the first instance of the audition scene, when Betty rehearses with Rita. The scene is important because of the dialogue. Also, this rehearsal of the scene is more important than the actual audition because, in this case, the dialogue is between Betty and Rita. Here are the highlights.
You're still here? I came back. I thought that's what you wanted.
This dialogue is similar to what Diane says in her apartment when she hallucinates and imagines that Camilla is back.
Now, if I tell what happened, they'll arrest you and put you in jail.
Again, Diane is worried about Dan telling the police what happened and being arrested as a consequence.
So get out of here before... Before what? Before I kill you. Then they'd put you in jail.
This is Diane's whole problem in a nutshell. She killed Camilla and the police are going to put her in jail.
And then I say with big emotion, I hate you! I hate us both!
Diane's subconscious is articulating the genesis of her problems. She developed a pathological hatred for Camilla. That pathology, in the fertile ground of social dysfunction and broken dreams, grew into self-hatred. She then killed Camilla, and now she's having to live with the consequences of her actions. When Betty goes to her audition, we witness some feel-good fantasy played out against a backdrop of rewriting history. The director is Bob Brooker, the director from the Sylvia North story. But he's clearly a caricature. He's overtly incompetent and leaves everybody dumbfounded whenever he speaks. The scene is exactly the same as the one rehearsed with Rita, but the performance feels completely different, sexy, sultry, and mesmerizing. Everybody in the room is transfixed by Betty. Undoubtedly, it's the kind of audition that Diane had always dreamed of having. Leaving with the visiting casting agent, Lynch, somebody who has access to real A-list projects in Hollywood, Betty learns that Bob Brooker and company are struggling has-beens with no real chance of success. Lynch, her assistant, and Betty enter the soundstage where Adam Kesher is auditioning women for the lead role in his new film. When Betty first arrives, an auditioning actress is lip-syncing to the song 16 Reasons Why I Love You, originally sung by Connie Stevens. The entire atmosphere of the audition, with fake backgrounds and actors lip-syncing, is more symbolism involving things not being what they appear to be. As the audition is happening, Adam looks over and notices Betty. He appears to be instantly infatuated, reluctant to look away. Once the song ends, Adam's told the next auditioning actress is the dream version of Camilla Rhodes, the woman to whom he is supposed to give the part. Somewhat hesitantly, he starts the audition. After a bit, he acquiesces and gives the part to Camilla Rhodes, using the line,
This is the girl.
Immediately, Betty looks down at her watch, realizes it's getting late, and she's supposed to meet up with Rita. She quickly excuses herself and runs away, while Adam watches her leave. Lenny and her assistant are left confused. This entire scene is Diane's subconscious engaging in pure fantasy. In the dream, Adam is instantly infatuated by Betty and can barely manage to look away. He undoubtedly would give the part to Betty if it were up to him. Unfortunately, it's not up to him. The Hollywood machine is forcing him to give the part to Camilla. In this sense, Betty is in competition with Dream Camilla, similar to the way Diane was in competition with the woman who looks like Dream Camilla for the real Camilla's affection. Moreover, the cause of Betty not getting the role has nothing to do with Betty. The Hollywood machine set the gears in motion probably before Betty even arrived in Hollywood. Betty is an amazing actress who effortlessly mesmerizes and infatuates those around her. Similar to Camilla in real life, but even more so. It's the unjust Hollywood machine that's preventing Betty from achieving the success that she rightfully deserves. This fantasy narrative is very satisfying to Diane because deep down, she knows in reality she's responsible for her own fate. The musical choices are also potentially meaningful. During the first audition, Adam notices and is transfixed by Betty. The song playing in the background is 16 Reasons Why I Love You, which is a song about genuine love. This song can be thought of as representing how Adam feels about Betty, even though he's only just laid eyes on her. The song that Dream Camilla sings is I've Told Every Little Star, which is a song of unexpressed and unconfirmed love. In this case, the song is a fitting representation of the feelings between Dream Camilla and Adam. Adam has neither expressed nor confirmed his love for Dream Camilla because he does not love her. He's only casting her for the lead role because he's being forced to. When Betty arrives back at Aunt Ruth's apartment, she and Rita set out to visit the dream version of Diane Selwyn. Soon after, Betty and Rita break into Diane's apartment and discover her rotting corpse lying on her bed. Rita is terrified. Of course, this is foreshadowing Diane's death and also a reveal that Diane's subconscious is already thinking about suicide. Of interest, a Mulholland Drive promotional image shows Rita lying in the same bed as Dream Diane's corpse. Basically, Rita is shown in a recreation of an earlier scene where she lies on the bed at Aunt Ruth's apartment. Notably, this scene is just prior to Betty covering Rita with the red and black robe, which we discussed earlier. In the promotional shot, however, it's clear that Rita's position is effectively a mirror image of Diane's dead body. Although not widely referenced, this image is a powerful bit of symbolism in that Rita is a reflection of Dream Diane's dead body, suggesting that, in reality, Diane's death becomes a reflection of Camilla's murder. Upon returning to the apartment, Rita frantically tries to cut her hair, seemingly instinctually knowing that she should be in fear for her life. Betty stops her, saying, I know what you have to do, let me do it. She then proceeds to disguise Rita using a blonde wig. Not coincidentally, Rita ends up looking remarkably like Betty. In some sense, Betty knows what needs to be done because they're in a dream constructed by her alter ego. She understands that Rita needs to be unrecognizable to Joe the Hitman, even if she can't articulate exactly why she knows it. Moreover, Betty changing Rita to look like Betty amounts to Diane's desire to remake Camilla in her own image. She wants to keep some of Camilla's key attributes while changing all of those aspects of Camilla that she doesn't like. In the end, she wants a Diane-like version of Camilla, which is represented through Rita being made to look like Betty. Also, the result of Betty's efforts are revealed as a reflection in a mirror. Here again, Lynch is highlighting that these people are not who they appear to be. They're representations of someone else. At the same time, Betty smiles and whispers, "You look like someone else." It's left as an exercise to the audience to figure out who that someone else actually is. Betty convinces Rita to sleep in her bed. Before long, one thing leads to another. Somewhere in the mix, Betty confesses her love for Rita a couple times. Honestly, it's a little surprising we don't have Rita confessing her love for Betty, or at least reciprocating. Perhaps Diane always wanted to confess her love to Camilla, but felt that she couldn't because their relationship had been primarily sexual. In the middle of the night, Rita wakes up Betty by repeating the word silencio in her sleep. Silencio is Spanish for silence, which, in this case, is a euphemism for death, of course. Betty agrees to go with Rita, disguised in her wig, to an unidentified destination that ends up being Club Silencio. At the club, the host, Bandar, speaks in a mix of Spanish, French, and English, explaining that there is no band, there is no orchestra, it's all a recording. The clear implication is that things are not what they seem, and it's all an illusion. This applies to the performances at Club Silencio, but it also applies to the happenings within the dream itself and to the characters of Betty and Rita. At one point, Bandar asks the audience to listen and then seemingly triggers a lightning and thunder effect. As the effect continues, Betty begins to convulse uncontrollably. Bandar appears to undergo some type of physical transformation that ends the lightning and thunder effect, as well as Betty's convulsing. He then crosses his arms, smiles in a way that looks very devilish, and disappears into a cloud of blue smoke. I suggest that Bandar's actions are actually conjuring the blue box into existence. Once Bandar's actions terminate, marked by a clear and obvious change in his character's look as well as an audio cue, the blue box is already in Diane's purse, just waiting to be discovered. Sometimes in film, a cinematic experience is much more powerful than its corresponding verbal description. The next scene is one such example. On paper, Rebecca Del Rio sings an a cappella version of Roy Orbison's song Crying in Spanish, while Rita and Betty cry before Rebecca collapses, revealing that she was lip-syncing. This description sounds interesting, but not especially compelling. It's generally in line with the other happenings at Club Silencio. What David Lynch captured on film, however, is one of the most memorable scenes in all of Mulholland Drive. The performance is so visceral, so dynamic, and so emotional. It's incredibly moving. And of course, it looks so real. The singing done by Rebecca Del Rio is very physical. The close-up camera angle makes it clear that the timing is incredibly precise. Even after sitting through Bandar talking about how nothing's real and it's all a recording, it still feels like Rebecca's singing must be authentic. So when she eventually does collapse, revealing it was all a recording, it has an incredible impact. Of course, the song Crying is a perfect fit for Diane's previous situation with Camilla, in that they had been together, they were no longer together, and Diane was left crying over Camilla. At this point, Betty discovers the blue box in her purse and the pair take it back to the apartment. Rita retrieves her purse from the hat box in the closet. Of note, the hat that was earlier on top of the purse is no longer present, and there appears to be significantly less money in the purse. These are both indications that Diane has used the money to pay the hitman. Strangely, Betty disappears. A confused Rita takes the key, opens the box, disappears, and the box falls on the floor. Betty disappearing is a manifestation of Diane's subconscious not wanting to be around when the box is open because she knows what it means. Rita disappearing is symbolic of her alter ego, Camilla, dying. At this point, the dream ends and the story transitions to the nonlinear reality section of the movie. We've already covered most of the meaningful parts of this section. However, there's one detail during the dinner party that deserves some attention. Right as Wilkins says, Camilla was great in that, referring to the Sylvia North story, Camilla can be heard off-screen talking in Spanish. When the camera turns to her, she looks indignant. For quite a while, I didn't realize that it was Camilla who was speaking Spanish off-screen. This is one of those times where watching with the captions on can actually add value in terms of understanding a movie. In English, she's saying, "I never went to Casablanca with Luigi." Two people reply, again in Spanish. Specifically, somebody says, "What a pity," and Adam says the equivalent of "Who cares?" The entire exchange is also highlighted musically. This sequence of events likely did not actually happen, and it illustrates that while most of the nonlinear reality section is real, it's still all colored by Diane's perception and perhaps her recollection. Of course, Casablanca is a treasured movie from the golden age of Hollywood. Released in 1943, the film stars Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. But I suggest the movie's relevance here has less to do with it being a Hollywood classic and more to do with the story. As the movie explains, Casablanca, a city in French Morocco, was one of the final stops on the path that many refugees took while trying to escape war-torn Europe during World War II. The problem was that people needed visas to leave Casablanca, so those without money or influence found themselves perpetually stuck in Casablanca. In one memorable scene, a young woman asks Rick, Humphrey Bogart's character, if Captain Renault, who is responsible for handing out visas, is honest and would be true to his word. The subtext is that Captain Renault has promised to provide visas to the woman and her husband if she agrees to have sex with him. This is exactly the type of quid pro quo trading of sexual favors for unjust consideration that, in Hollywood, Diane tried to participate in, failed, and was then victimized by. Camilla's symbolic declaration and her look of indignation amounts to a denial of having used sex to achieve success. Of course, she's almost certainly lying. Also, Adam, a director, is saying who cares because he expects such quid pro quo transactions to be part of the process. He's used to it. Most of the meaning I've discussed as we've gone through the movie. There is, however, one more significant bit of symbolism that ties a few things together that is best examined separately. In particular, David Lynch uses smoke to symbolize death. The most obvious usage happens when Diane takes her own life at the end of the movie, and the bed on which she's lying is enveloped in smoke. This is the instance from which we can infer the symbolism, which allows us to apply the understanding to other scenes. The next notable scene in which smoke and its symbolized death are present is the car crash at the beginning of the movie. This commingling of smoke and death strengthens the symbolism, but it's not especially meaningful. The most meaningful instance occurs when the homeless person behind Winkie's is shown with the blue box, right after Diane hires Joe the hitman. As the camera turns the corner, we see the homeless person examining the blue box. A fire behind the homeless person self-extinguishes, and the significant cloud of smoke emanates from where the fire was. Given the context of the scene and the described symbolism of the homeless person being the ugly side of Diane that arranged for Camilla's death, the fire being extinguished and the resulting cloud of smoke represent Camilla being murdered by Joe the hitman. This is why the homeless person is shown with the blue box at that very moment. Finally, at Club Silencio, when Bondar conjures up the blue box, he disappears into a cloud of blue smoke. Again, the blue box is appearing in close proximity to a cloud of smoke, which represents Camilla's death. To be sure, David Lynch was an exceptionally creative filmmaker whose ideas often defied conventional labeling. He usually had very clear ideas about what he did and did not want to do, and he often appeared to care more about artistic success than commercial success, although he certainly achieved an impressive amount of both. Mulholland Drive, simply by virtue of being a David Lynch artistic endeavor, was sure to have more than its fair share of strange and intriguing elements. But once you throw in an unusual origin story where the film evolved from television pilot to feature film, with over a year-long break before resurrection and additional shooting, you have the ingredients for a very unique story indeed. Nevertheless, as we've seen, buried underneath all of this abstraction and symbolism lies a well-defined story rooted in some of the most basic elements of human existence: broken dreams, rejection, jealousy, and revenge. In my estimation, Mulholland Drive is a masterpiece, certainly one of the best movies of the 21st century. I hope you like this movie as much as I do, and I also hope you've enjoyed this video as we've peeled back the layers of the masterpiece. As always, thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. It really does help, and I truly appreciate it. If by chance you're interested in true crime, you may like my 3-volume set of books about the 20th century's most enigmatic, never-apprehended serial killer, the Zodiac. Here's another in-depth analysis video from the channel. This has been Mike on Media. Until next time.